Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Four Space. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for today's event, Who's Afraid of Sex Ed? Possibilities and Practices in Comprehensive Sexuality Education. Just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from Four Space. We are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Four Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects and things happening all across the university. And we're also running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting, so anyone joining us there, if you have any comments or questions, just pop those into the chat. We could read them out a little bit later. And those of you here in the space, if you have comments or questions later on, just raise your hand. We'll run a microphone over to you so that everyone can hear. Okay, with that, it's very much my pleasure. Hand things over to the prof for ED 640-440, Comprehensive Sexuality Education, but also Canada Research Chair in Social Justice in Youth and Child Studies, Casey Burkholder. Casey, it's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. What a mouthful. So good afternoon, everybody. As we're about to talk about bodies and boundaries and sex and the political, I want to offer a territorial acknowledgement to get us started in a good way. So I want to acknowledge that here we're gathered today on the traditional unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, recognized as the caretakers of the land and waters here in Tiohtià:ke. This land has been a long space of meeting, exchange, and relationship building for many First Nations and continues to be a home to diverse Indigenous peoples and also other communities. As we take a moment to reflect on this land and its histories, I also want to recognize that issues of gender, sexuality, and bodily autonomy have been deeply impacted by colonial systems that have sought to regulate Indigenous bodies, identities, and knowledges. In the context of sex ed, we commit to acknowledging and challenging these colonial legacies by centering care-forward, justice-based approaches that honor Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and relating. I also want to respect the enduring connections between peoples, lands, genders, and generations, and we seek to build better relationships rooted in accountability, reciprocity, and care. Thanks. And so, as mentioned, my name is Casey Burkholder, and I'm a bisexual femme teacher educator who's deeply interested in sex education, what is happening and what might happen. Growing up as a closeted queer person in Alberta in the deeply homophobic 90s drives my research and teaching in sex education as a form of both resistance and repair. I'm a former middle school teacher, and I'm now an associate professor and research chair here at Concordia University. So I used to teach at a bad school, quote unquote, in Hong Kong from 2008 to 2010, where I taught sexuality education in more informal spaces through my work as a classroom teacher. This looked like helping students navigate unwanted pregnancies, access birth control, seek testing for STIs, and answering students' many questions. So even though sexuality education was not in my formal teaching load, it was a big part of my work, and it still is. So I just finished teaching my first year at Concordia. I moved here from the University of New Brunswick. And last time around this time of year, then Premier Blaine Higgs sought to politicize what was going on in sex education as an attempt to pit so-called parents' rights against teachers, the notion of sex ed in schools, and gender and sexual minorities. For instance, in a media scrum in May of last year, then Premier Higgs declared, "Should kids in kindergarten be exposed to drag queen reading time? Because no, I don't think they should at that age. Are we trying to teach tolerance and acceptance, or are we trying to teach promotion?" So when we ask the question, who is afraid of sex ed, one person we can absolutely point to is former Premier, New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs. Albertan Premier Danielle Smith too. She is also terrified of sex ed, which is really boring. So this afternoon, we are going to respond to the question, who is afraid of sex ed, through 11 student papers created in a graduate level seminar on comprehensive sex education. Taken together, the papers theorize comprehensive sex ed alongside the claim that we are making. And that claim is, we can do better than what we ourselves received as young people in schools. We will also offer a panel that gets into critical sex education pedagogies in response to suspicions about what could possibly be going on in sex ed classrooms. So specifically, the papers in this session aim to contribute to a more nuanced understanding of how diversities operate in and around sex ed classrooms, considering how sex education might be reframed into spaces of inquiry and curiosity and joyful queer futures, accessible to all students and all teachers in all their multitudes and across the lifespan. So each presenter is going to have about 5 to 8 minutes to present, and we'll end the session with a brief question and answer period. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presenter in the We Can Do Better panel, and that's Liz Evenou.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Liz, and today I'm going to be talking about my paper, and the title is Centering Queer BIPOC Students' Agency in Sex Health Education. And so before talking about sexual agency, I wanted us to think about the curriculum and how it is problematic. If we think about the current curriculum as it is evidence-based, risk and disease-centered, which means ultimately that it talks about sex and sexuality in a very scientific way, trying to reduce unwanted pregnancies and really controlling STIs and having youth be really safe without leaving space for anything else. For example, joy and youth discovering what makes them feel good. And this is done in a way that follows cis heteronormative white supremacy models. And all of that to say that we're looking at white bodies, white people, men and women, so really following a sex gender binary, and how they're moving about their sexual, education, health, and adventures, but disregarding indigenous, African, and overall non-Western ways of doing and other practices that may happen. And doing that, we're following normative scripts. So like I've mentioned, really looking at men and women, only a binary exists, and we disregard queer, gender diverse, just other ways of being and moving throughout the world, which is very damaging for queer youth specifically, because there's no space for them to talk about their experiences and be open and feel like they're in an affirmative, safe space to do so. And so overall, when you look at the research and they ask queer youth specifically, well, how was your sex health education? Most of them respond, well, it was basically non-existent. Not talking about my experiences, I don't feel like I can connect with what's been said in the classroom space. And if things are mentioned, it feels irrelevant and doesn't actually help them with really helpful information. It's just in passing, and usually teachers are going to talk about things in a really fear and shameful way, which then again doesn't help queer youth, because they need the space and they need to have an open space and feel like they can talk and be who they want to be in that space. And so if we think about sexual agency, here obviously I want to talk about sexual freedom, but also thinking about how it's a really changing force for people, especially youth. It creates opportunities for them to explore their identities, embody a sexual self that is rooted in pleasure, joy, and possibility, which is, I want to really emphasize, really contrary to what the normative discourse is, because normally we're going to center youth, especially marginalized youth, in a really risk, depression, oh my God, they're really doing bad, really focusing on the negative aspects. But I want to talk about sexual agency and a positive drive force to move away from that. And so theoretical framework, I've based my work on queer pedagogy, women of color feminism, and decolonial epistemology. All of that to say, I want to critique the current curriculum. I want to problematize it, move away from it, and find ways to bring youth of color in the classroom as a space for them to feel embodied in the discourses that are happening and feel like they have the space to do so. But at the same time, really centering queer joy, because like I've mentioned, it's something that people don't necessarily think about. And I think it's really powerful to have youth feel joyful in their experiences, because sex is a beautiful thing. And it allows for so much discovery. And so emphasizing joy in this theoretical framework, I think, was really important. And for my methods, I've looked at research surrounding queer joy, BIPOC experiences in schools, queer pedagogy, youth-led initiatives to guide my research, and I came about with 25 articles. So, reimagining sex ed, what can that look like? I wanted to emphasize 3 different things. So the first one, having a curriculum that is culturally, socially, and racially relevant, because the current sex ed curriculum does not emphasize or bring in these really important aspects that are relevant for youth, because they are living and embodying, their experiences in the world as they see it. It is important to take that into consideration. Having a space that is fluid and co-constructed, and so really moving away from the top-down teacher to student, teacher knows it all, having all the knowledge, but instead focusing on having youth be learners, but also teachers in the space, exchanging, learning from each other, and leaving space for their curiosities to take place. And by having a fluid space and moving away from the normal quote unquote structure of this classroom space, this leaves so much more possibilities for youth to actually be engaged with the material and really feel like they're learning what they want to learn at their own pace. And participatory approach only means to have youth ask the questions, but also come up with their own definition and their own responses to what they feel is relevant for them in that moment. And so overall, what's the impact? Well, my paper really wanted to disrupt the narrative that situates queer youth only in relation to trauma and violence. Like I've mentioned, it really is a negative lens that usually people are going to look at marginalized communities throughout. So I'm just really hoping that by having youth be closer to their sexual agency and explore space that would feel affirmative for them, that we could foreground joy, agency, and transformation in doing so. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. I'm so glad I'm not the first one to do that. Okay. My presentation going to include in 2 parts. One is the introduction that explains why I want to choose this topic. It is abstinence-only education. And the second part will be the findings that I have. So, okay. Here, this is the title of my paper. It's Rethinking Abstinence and Comprehensive, a narrative review of school-based sex education in developed country. Well, I wanted to first explain my reasons that I chose this topic is because I grew up in an East Asian country, China, where the general cultural atmosphere about sexuality is relatively resistive. But interestingly, after enrolling this course, after I doing deeper research on sex ed, I found there's a word that is abstinence-only education. I feel this is so strange that such restrictive idea is so popular in this developed countries, and it has been heavily promoted and federally funded. I just feel this so strange. And furthermore, for some concerted ideas, I have to admit that it can help prevent some risks, like to encouraging the young people to be cautious, that can prevent some risks. But I don't think that is the only choice that we have when we're doing the sex ed. So that ideas lead me to think how I should approach AOE, how to approach this concept. Okay, so to develop this review, I searched the Google Scholar, Sophia database, and Eric, this platform, since it's a narrative review. So I just started with some recent review articles to map hot arguments, and then read some empirical studies. Then I screened about, due to the time limit, I screened about 30 studies and distilled the arguments and evidences into things like the social change and student perceptions, government role, blah, blah, blah. And this review is basically structured through consensus, disparities, and some neutral points. And it ends with a recommendation for some future research and teaching practice and curriculum design. Okay, here are my findings. Well, the first one is the consensus. The most studies support that the comprehensive theory-based interactive sex ed programs can be effective, improving students' knowledge, intentions, and attitudes. But they hold negative attitudes towards abstinence-only education for its reinforcement of the harmful stereotype. It is also insufficient to effectively teach students how to prevent themselves and recognize to sexual assaultment. Besides, many empirical studies have consistently found that little statistically significant effect of AOE manifests on teens' births and the teens' abortion rates. And in addition, they assumes that education can be a site for certain government and subjective. So for the disparity part, there's always a persistent public and parental opposition believing that it will lead to unhealthy curiosity. But some of the articles also assume that abstinence education was often mispresented because they believe that if the parents understood the nuances and differences between the two educations, the parents would prefer the conservative one. And what's more, neutral voices exist. Some abstinence advocate parents want their children to have great sex, but practiced in marriage. And some articles insist that the dominant dual narrative, like the abstinence education versus comprehensive education, creates an unhelpful dichotomy that oversimplifies the issue. So the binary framing contributes to policy stagnant and prevents consensus building. Okay, the first part is the inspirations. I concluded into two parts. One is for future study and the other is for the practical teaching and curriculum design. Okay, for the future study, the first one will be the evaluations. Align evaluation with evidence-based frameworks that focus on the evaluation that how better performance that the students can make after certain education pedagogy. And the second one is investigate mechanism behind policy and effectiveness, because the inconstant education policy can definitely cause to unpredictable social changes. So what kind of influence that the policy can bring to the education and what kind of solution that school or teachers can do to prevent or to tackle this situation is also a very important topic on this field. And the third one is to move beyond the binary, as we have mentioned, that develop and test a new curriculum. And the fourth one is to explore how parents communicate about sex at home and what resources they need. Even we're talking about the sex ed based on the school, but I think there's also a part of responsibility for school to offer some resources and directions for parents at home, because the parents' education at home should align with the education at school. So that is also a very important topic. And for the future teaching suggestion, the first one will be the provide full specific information rather than treat students as afterthoughts. And the second one is adapt materials to local values and collaborate with community stakeholders. And third one is audit existing curricula for implicit message that will reinforce victim blaming. And the last one is also evaluation, to trying to figure out what kind of perception that the students have. So yeah, that's all I have. Yes. Thank you.
Happy Thursday, everyone. Is that Thursday? Yes. My name is Frida, and today I present Unsurveyed Sexuality, Abolitionist Refusal, and the Racial Optics of Consent in Quebec's Sex Education. But let me start with a provocation. What if sex education isn't about empowerment, but about control? In Quebec, sex education is presented as progressive, promoting consent, responsibility, and safety. And believe me, comparing to my country, it is. But my research reveals that curriculum functions as a carceral apparatus disproportionately surveilling Black and racialized youth. My problematic is, how does sex education in Quebec function as surveillance, and how might we radically reimagine it? Today, I will walk you through, hopefully, theoretical frameworks, the method and methodology I use, including photo voice, and share key findings that invite us to reorient sex education toward what I call unsurveyed sexuality. I ground my analysis in three intersecting frameworks. Simone Brown's racializing surveillance theory shows how institutions make Blackness hypervisible through tools that appear neutral. And then from there, I got involved with Bettina Law that critiques the educational survival complex that disciplines rather than liberates racialized youth. And then finally, regarding queer curriculum theory with Louisa Allen that proposes smell walks and other sensuous methods to reclaim sexuality from normative, disembodied instruction. From these, alongside other theoretical frameworks, I developed the concept of unsurveyed sexuality. And for me, it's a pedagogy that refuses carcerality and centers relationality, joy, and epistemic disobedience. My methodology is a critical intertextual reading of Quebec's policy documents. I went through 6 different governmental related documents and the Photo Voice project by Dixon et al. That we have studied together. And to trace the curriculum's gaze, I employ a critical intertextual method grounded in abolitionist and participatory research. Here on Quebec's sex education curriculum is structured through STI prevention, personal responsibility, and consent checklists. Here, risk is racialized, responsibility is individualized, and structural violence is erased. Going through MES, sex education toolkit, making proud choices, EMSB agenda for sex education. There is no place for teaching solo sex, masturbation, sex toy, sexting, or any other things that Arizona call it free dreaming. And it's always about prevention, safety, and how to afraid of sex education. So there is no space for pausing for racialized and Black students and individuals to think of who they are today, because tomorrow it might change, and especially when it comes to their sexuality. So the other aspect that I tried to have in my conversation in my paper was photo voice that lets us use to speak back to surveillance. One use captures rusted chains and write, the chains cannot be broken with wind. The chain has to be broken with action. Another names a police booth image that potentialization, focusing on potentialization, noting that police aren't present where white people live. We all studied that specific piece, and these images and captions resist being managed by the curriculum and expose the racialized terrain of sex education. They don't ask for inclusion, they perform refusal. Here's what I found. Consent is procedural, not relational. It becomes a box-seeking exercise, not an ethic of mutuality. For Black youth, consent education flattens their experiences and scripts them as risky. There is another aspect into that risk is individualized. STI prevention modules ignore structural racism and reduce safety to good choices, especially when it comes to female students and the idea of good girl. And also non-normative embodiments, queer, disabled, racialized, are also erased. The curriculum doesn't just teach, it disciplines. It surveys not only bodies, but also potentialities. So at this stage, unsurveyed sexuality for me personally is not about improving the curriculum. It's about disobeying it. It's a fugitive pedagogy rooted in abolition, in Black feminist ethics, in queer disorientation. It begins in the senses, not the scripts. It centers not learning outcomes, but youth refusal, sensation, and relational autonomy. So for this specific semester and this specific course, my question from the beginning was, or my concern was, I was so exhausted that everything that we are learning in a very theoretical manner, how we can practice it in our classroom. And I think it was the only semester that I've learned how to practice what we've learned in a very theoretical manner. So with zines making, smell walks, critical storytelling, for me now after this course, these aren't just add-ons. There are epistemic ruptures. As bell hooks reminds us, to be in the margin is to be the origin of possibility. So what do? We refuse as educators and as individuals that we are kind of involved with this process. Unsurveyed sexuality is not about making sex more inclusive, as I mentioned before. Use-led zines, smell walk, everything that we practice in a practical manner in this course. These are not extracurriculars, these are insurgent pedagogies, and sex ed should not produce compliance. It should unleash creativity, relationality, and erotic sovereignty. So this is my call. Let's stop teaching under the gaze. Let's start teaching toward liberation, to move from institutional gaze to youth refusal, and not to fix the curriculum, but to remake the fill entirely. Thank you so much.
Okay, so today I want to talk a lot about reproductive health specifically. My previous classmates have talked a lot about how sex ed kind of has a lot of downfalls. So I want to talk a little bit more about specifically for people with vaginas and vulvas and how they don't learn certain things and they might feel alone in their bodies. So why is it important? Obviously, it has been talked about a bit, but sex education needs to be extensive for adolescents to understand their bodies, to understand what's going to happen to them, and to feel like what's happening is normal, that they're not weird for certain things that are occurring. And then later on in their adult life, they're knowledgeable about their bodies. It can also help them make informed decisions on what to do for certain situations or for what they might need if something happens to their body. It can also, specifically, I want to talk about like taking away the taboos behind so many things that occurs with like vaginas and vulvas. And I have found that excluding certain details can help. It continues inequality between talking about different bodies. And so if we talk about it, we bring it into the normal conversation, we can kind of take away those inequalities. And for some people, it can be difficult with their sex life because of some things that are happening with their bodies. So if we can educate ourselves on these things that are happening, it can help them maybe have a better sex life. Okay, so quickly, I want to talk about, I'm going to go into certain things that we don't get taught fully. So I'm sure that we were all taught about pads and tampons, but I also find that there's so many different options nowadays. There's menstrual cups, there's menstrual discs, there's period underwear, and some people will just stick with the pads and tampons because that's all they know, and they might not be fully comfortable with it. So I always encourage everybody to try out these different options because they can help them find something that works for their body better, that they're more comfortable with, and make their menstruation time more comfortable, more pleasant. Maybe they'll forget about it for one day because they're comfortable and they won't have to deal with it. So I think it's important to know all of these different products. Another thing that we don't learn a lot about is about discharge. So discharge is natural. It happens to everybody with a vulva and a vagina. And that this discharge is so healthy, so natural, and so amazing what it can do. So it naturally helps clean the vagina, the vulva, and it protects the vagina from bacteria and dead skin cells, which I think is super important and super interesting that it naturally does this. And that the color of your discharge can actually tell you what's happening with your own body. So depending on the different color will depend on maybe what's happening down there. And also if there's an odor or a smell that's not normal, that can give you some insight that there might be something happening down there that you might need to check up on. Because normal healthy discharge is like there's no itchiness, there's no burning, there's no soreness. So yeah. Also, hormones change the amount of discharge that occurs throughout the cycle. So that is normal. And also when you're aroused, there's normally more discharge. It's also super cool because you don't technically need to clean up in there. It can actually throw off the pH balance. And so I don't think that's commonly known, that it kind of cleans itself. So you don't need to use strong soaps. You can just use some water and maybe a mild soap depending on your body. The next thing that is not talked about is contraception. A lot of the times either a condom or abstinence or the pill is talked about for contraception, but there's so many different options. And contraception can not only be beneficial for pregnancy prevention, it can help with regulating hormones, regulating a period, and maybe sometimes making somebody's cycle more comfortable for them. And I think it's awesome that our science has come this far. There's also so many different types of contraception. So there's barriers, which create the barrier between the sperm and the egg. There's hormonal, that affects your hormones and then changes ovulation, changes cervical mucus. There's uterine devices, which are also called IUDs. So they're inserted into the vagina surgically, and they change your cervix and your uterus to prevent pregnancy. And then there's sterilization, which is surgical procedures that inhibit pregnancy permanently or semi-permanently. So not one contraception is better for the other. I know some people will suffer through their contraception because they might think it's the only option and that's the best one, everybody swears by it, but everybody's body is different. So I always encourage everybody to try the one that works best for you. If the IUD might not work, the ring might work, depending on your body, you know? Next, I want to talk about pleasure and desires. So I'm going to start this off with wanting sex is absolutely normal. There's nothing wrong with it. Even if you have a clitoris, you do not need to have a penis to enjoy sex, to want sex, to have those desires, to have that connection with somebody else. And I don't think that's talked about at all. So I think it's important to talk about it. I also love to say that, like, if you have a clitoris, it can be harder to climax and you just might need to try out some different things. In some of the research that I found, some women are not aware of their body, so they don't know, they want to have a better sex life, but they don't know how to get there. So, because they're not informed about it. So I think it's important to talk about these things that you can do differently with your body to get there. So the last thing that I want to talk about is, I obviously only had like 5 to 8 minutes today, so I can't talk about everything that I think we're missing. But I also think we're missing talking about hormonal changes that occur and how that can affect your body, your mental health, everything. Also, like what a healthy and average cycle is, because some might think it's normal to not have a period for 3 months, when that might not be exactly the case, and maybe you should get checked up for that. There's also fertility that's not talked about. There's also pregnancy experiences that aren't talked about. There's postpartum, there's menopause. There's so many of these topics that we never talk about that I think is so important to talk about. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I was given a microphone, lucky me. The next person to go will be Clement.
Okay, thank you. Please, my name is Clement, and I'm presenting on the topic from my home country, which is parents, religion, and sex education. Back home, when growing up, I realized our parents do not talk about sex education to us because of what we call religion. Back in Ghana, we have three types of religion. We have the Christians, we have the Muslims, and we have the traditional worshippers. And both of them do not talk about sex education because of the norms that we have with sex education. Okay, so sex education is vital, but very, very controversial in Ghana because people feel ashamed to talk about it. And even when growing up, there are certain things you can't say about your body, especially the parts of your body. And with me, the things that I noticed when growing up was just the aspect of science, that is biology, that I learned, my leg, my shoulder, and other parts that I know. Because no one taught to me about sex education, not in schools and not at home. Okay. And the reason why parents feel lack of communication between parents and their children is religion. Because when we go to church or they go to the mosque or when they go to the shrine, you are being warned that when you talk about sex to your kids, it's a taboo. So it becomes very difficult for parents to talk to their kids about sex education. Okay. So the purpose of this was to know the reason why parents do not talk about it. Okay, so the first one, that is my objective of doing this research, was I wanted to examine their perceptions because I know it has been passed on from generation to generation why they don't talk about sex education. And also with religious leaders, what are some of the things that make them to tell other people not to talk about sex education? And also investigate the balance of faith and sex education. That is, the faith comes with the religion. And okay, so these are the questions that I placed a call to. These are the questions that I used in getting the information from the parents. So the first one was, what our parents believe? That is the religion. What hinders communication? And also the last one being, how do parents manage conflicting values? Okay, so these are the theories that I use. So the first one is attitude, and the second one is subjective norm, and the pre-received control. So I placed a call to 5 people. 3 of them were parents, and 2 were adolescents. Okay, so the first person, in Ghana, we have 10 regions. As in Canada, you talk about provinces. In Ghana, we use regions. Okay, so we have the Ashanti region, we have the Greater Accra, and we have the northern part, because the northern part is made of most Muslims, and the Ashanti region is for traditional worshippers, and the Greater Accra is made of Christians. So I had to place a call to at least have a view from different parents and see how their beliefs are affecting communication with their kids in sex education. Okay, so from our findings, I get to know parents feel awkward in talking about sex education, or they are not even prepared to talk about it. And the second one is that they believe religion has made it silence, because we go to church, the pastors or the priest will tell you, you don't have to talk about sex education to your kids. And also the last one is the community norms. Within the community, what are some of the things others are going to say about your parents when they talk to you about sex education? And these are some of the quotes that was being said by the people I interviewed. So the first one was, it feels awkward to talk about it. And the second one is, let the school handle it. So that means the kids will be going to school. The school has to teach them the sex education. And the last one is, let's pray. Okay, so that means instead of we talking about it, we have to talk to God about it. And these are some of the challenges that I noticed from the interview so negative attitude and lack of vocabs. So that means there are less words to this kind of communication that the parents have to do with their kids. So there are lack of words. In our local language, there are different words that you can use for the part of the body. But when it comes to sex, there are certain words you are not even supposed to say, even at home, in school. And when you say them, you are going to be punished for saying that, but it's part of the body. Okay. And the next one is the religious leaders. They stress more about abstinence only. So that means you don't have to have sex until you are 18. That's the only thing that they talk about when you go to churches. Okay. And the last one is with the social media. So if adolescents want information, what they turn it to is the social media. That is where they can get a lot of information from. Okay, so the last one is the conclusion and recommendation. So the conclusion, religion and culture have created silence. And the next one, we need to reform the faith that we have. So that is the Christianity, the Muslims, and also the traditional worship. They have to reform everything. And also we have to also create a way of talking about sex education in schools. And okay, so my recommendation is we have to get a workshop for parents so that they will be able to educate their kids about sex education, and faith-based training that also deals with the churches, and also the revision of curriculums. That means with schools, we have to try to revive so many of the things that are within the curriculum so that it will help the kids to know more about sex education. And the last one is the community. We have to also educate the community about sex education. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last paper from this panel is with Megan.
Hi, everybody. Just give me 1 second. Alrighty. Hi, my name is Megan. I use she, they pronouns. I am a PhD student in the education program with Dr. Casey Burkholder. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my paper, which is titled Doing Sex Ed Differently: Pleasurable, Playful, Queer Sexuality Education for Older Adults. Sex and old age is a taboo and uncomfortable topic. Nobody wants to think about their grandparents having sex. But older adults are full humans, despite what ageist discourses would tell you, who are still valuable, desirable, knowledgeable, capable, and deserve to have access to a full spectrum of life, including sexuality. So as I will unpack in this presentation, many older adults never had access to comprehensive sex education in their life and have carried shame-based and negative beliefs about sex into later life. So what if we took later life as an opportunity to teach sex education differently, centering pleasure and play rather than disease, decline, and risk? So as we've discussed already, the dominant approach to sex education across the life course is risk and fear. And so when you look at sex education for youth, there's this central discourse about protecting childhood innocence. There's also all sorts of other risky discourses going on, such as preventing sexual violence or preventing pregnancy and STBBIs, and even the inclusion of queerness in many educational curriculums are positioned as reducing the risk of suicide and depression. On the other side, if you look at sexuality and aging, there's similar discourses of risk and fear going on. There's this idea that old age is a time of asexuality, that sex is the purview of the young. There's a focus on dysfunction and pathologizing aging bodies and needing to fix those bodies, aging bodies, with biomedical interventions. And then there's this sexy senior discourse, which basically says, well, older adults are allowed to have sex, but only in heteronormative ways, and they should do so so that they remain youthful. So those are the dominant discourses happening around aging and sex. Why do we need sex education for elders? So if you thought your sex ed was bad, just imagine how it was for your grandparents. Many older adults, like I said, never received sex education at all. They carry shame and negativity around sexuality all of their lives. We also know that older adults are still sexually active in later life. Older adults are still having sex, breaking up, hooking up, masturbating, watching porn, coming out, transitioning, getting STBBIs, experiencing sexual violence, learning about their desire, and dating in later life. Rates of STBBIs are rising in the population above 50 years old, and many healthcare providers do not feel comfortable and do not receive training about how to talk about sex with older adults. So in this paper, I ask and I wonder how we might imagine a sex education for older adults outside of these discourses of risk. How might we imagine joyful, playful, pleasure-focused, comprehensive sex education in later life? And in what contexts might this sex education take place? And how might we access the populations of older adults that need sex education? So I conducted a critical narrative review in the literature about sex education for elders, and I focused my review around 10 texts. And so the findings are organized around 3 themes. The first is about risk. So risk, again, surprise, surprise, was the main discourse in sexuality education for older adults, primarily around the concept of STBBI prevention. There was the language of preventing risky behavior, as well as heightened susceptibility to STBBIs in later life, and that this was due to a lack of communication. I also looked at how pleasure was discussed in the literature. So some more coded ways of talking about pleasure was under the guise of empowerment, what some older adults refer to as like the right to access sexuality and to enjoy sex. On the part of physicians, they talked about pleasure as in a quality of life indicator, but there were a few people that did center pleasure from the beginning and talk about the need to talk about masturbation and porn with older adults as well. And then I was also looking at how the sex education was happening or proposed to happen with older adults. So some of the suggestions that they came up with in these various research articles, dissertations, was to do so in small group workshops in non-formal settings. And there was suggestions that gerontological social workers would be well positioned to facilitate. And there was also some research about the importance of online resources for older adults. So before I get into a bit of my analysis, I just want to point you towards an area of literature that talks about how old age is a space of possibility. So Lynn Sandberg, love her, says, old age is a time of possibility to rethink sexualities, gender, and embodiment. And some scholars who have looked at sexuality and later life have found that there's this ability to relinquish some guilt and shame with later life sexuality, making sex more pleasurable. And if you look at critical dementia studies, they talk about later life as a time where you start to care less about social norms and can stop performing as much in things like family, heterosexuality, and binary gender. So I see this as an opportunity to bring a queerer version of sex ed and sexuality to later life. So what I did was, oh, my background's gone. I tried to imagine what a playful and pleasure-focused sex ed would look like, and I proposed 3 suggested activities to undertake with elders. The first was, and this is based on queer and trans scholarship in sex education. The first was about collaging, making a collage to remix and challenge messages about sexuality and aging. My other was about bringing drag performance into a long-term care facility. And the last one was about a masturbation and pleasure workshop in the context of an in-home sex toy party. There's some ideas to percolate on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are now going to begin our second panel on critical sex education pedagogies, and we're going to turn to the internet, where we're going to meet with Vanessa.
Hello, everyone. I'm wondering, Casey, were my slides uploaded okay? Or is there an issue with the slides?
There may be an issue with the slides.
Okay, is it better if oh yeah, okay. Is it better if I share my screen?
I think yes.
Okay, let's do that. So sorry, give me a brief moment.
Please take your time, no sweat.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Okay. Okay, so are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. And I'm so sorry, are you just seeing, what exactly are you seeing?
Exactly right now, I am seeing the slide methodology, queer futurity, and now exactly I'm seeing radical futures.
Yay, okay, awesome. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I can also have my notes open.
For sure.
Okay, excellent. So I'm just gonna start with a very brief introduction about myself, just to contextualize my approach to this paper. So my name is Vanessa. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an undergraduate student at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. So I study sexuality studies. I'm also the general coordinator of the Concordia Student Union, and it's my second term at the Student Union. And I say that all to say that like social justice and organizing is essentially my entire life. Also, my cultural background is I'm Guatemalan Argentinian, which shapes my approach to my work as well. And I'm also from Calgary, like Casey. So Casey and I have bonded over being shown the 80s version of Degrassi as sex ed. But yeah, that's pretty much as comprehensive of a sex ed that I received growing up. And as like a non-binary and queer person, like there was just no discussion of that whatsoever. So this paper, I'm discussing children's literature as a tool to foment revolution, essentially. And I examined 7 to 8 different articles. Some of them were talking about the current state of sex education in the United States and Canada. Some were talking about book bans and the effect of book bans, and specifically how that affects queer youth. And then other articles were more discussing the radical potentials of children's literature as well as the novel. So I will move on to discuss my methodology. So I am employing Jose Esteban Munoz for my methodology, and I always find it difficult to paraphrase Munoz. I find his theory to be a little bit heady and up in the air, but also like very impactful. So essentially what Munoz is theorizing here is that queerness, or a radical queerness, is not yet something we've achieved, but rather it lives somewhere in a time limbo in the future. And while that may feel abstract, I understand Munoz's perspective is that it's a call to radicalize the everyday. And in this context, that would be sex education. So this asks us to act as though we have already achieved utopia, to dare to dream, and to dare to build a new world. This is not achieved through accepting the present as is, but rather by challenging it. So this is the methodological approach to this essay, that to build a better world, one that is not confined by colonial greed and white supremacy, we must imagine new ways to be in the world. And in this context, that is through radical sex education. So my methodology and the approach to this paper is quite theory heavy. So next, I will be discussing popular education. So popular education is also referred to as an education for critical consciousness. It's both a pedagogical approach and a vessel for social change, and it was coined by a Brazilian theorist. His name is Paulo Freire. And popular education it disrupts like formal and elitist institutions of academia, which we often refer to as education, but popular education is a collective approach to teaching. So it's just teaching, coming together as a community and talking to each other, learning about each other, reading books together. In popular education, there's no teacher-learner binary, rather an acknowledgement that we are all teachers and learners alike. And it is a method for bringing knowledge and political consciousness to the masses, especially to marginalized communities who may not have the time or resources to access traditional forms of education. So Pop Ed says that education is for all, and that through growing our consciousness, through discussion and knowledge exchange, we create opportunities for revolution. So my next slide is entitled The Problem. And this is just, the problem is what I've dubbed like the current state of sex education, which is largely influenced in the West, so specifically US and Canada, by the religious right and Victorian attitudes, specifically with this notion of the romantic child, which posits children as innocent, as lacking agency, and being in need of protection. As such, this is largely rooted in heteronormativity and patriarchal values, and often this form of sex education only focuses on the physical aspects of sex, which are a highly sanitized and biological understanding, which does not make room for queer sexuality, gender, or biological difference. So in this approach to sex education, there's no room for affect, there's no room for somatic experience, not much discussion of bodily autonomy, consent, queer sexuality, or exploration of gender expression. And as such, the current state of sex education prioritizes adult fears over children's sexuality, safety, autonomy, and curiosity. So the next slide is called the solution. So the solution that I'm putting forward is, I imagine that children's literature in combination with popular education can be a tool for world building. It can be a tool for providing youth with a holistic sex education that explores feeling, mind-body connection, being in community with other people versus just this is a vulva and this is a penis. So one of the articles that I examined was by an author, Jen Gilbert, and she discusses the potential of the novel as a space where youth can explore questions of love, sex, and relationships with room for curiosity and introspection. And the novel provides the reader with autonomy to create their own affective understandings of sexuality and gender. Another article I imagined by Mestre and Vives Barcelo was, it was in English and Spanish, so it was really interesting. But it explains that children's literature utilizes text, colors, and images to draw in the attention of the reader, and in the case of this article, young children. And they argue that children's literature is a powerful pedagogical tool for connecting children with the world around them, and has the potential to foster curiosity and a desire to learn in children. So my last slide here is a case for popular education, which marries the potential of children's literature with the potential for social change of popular education. And I argue that popular education and children's literature creates pathways for people to introspect. By doing this in collaboration with popular education as a community, we introspect and then discuss with others, creating opportunities for social connection and empathy with people from different backgrounds and experiences. This carries radical potential in a society which places a large emphasis on the individual and often seeks to fracture community to serve colonial powers. Much of repression, bigotry, judgment, and shame come from a lack of understanding and empathy for people different from oneself. Through popular education through the sex ed lens, not only can we empower youth to explore their sexuality with curiosity and agency, but we can also teach them to be in community with one another and to learn from one another. So I'll finish with hopefully a little bit of inspiration where I say radical or holistic sex education and popular education can actually transform the world because it teaches us to question structures of oppression, to be in community with one another, to trust our bodies, and to decolonize sex and gender and relationships as we know it. So I hope I didn't go over time, but thank you so much. And thank you for accommodating me online today. I really appreciate it. Oh, and then my
So we miss you, but thank you for being with us. Okay, next up we have Anna and Daniela.
Okay. Can everyone hear us? Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Hello, online viewers and our audience members. My name is Daniela, and
I'm Anna.
And we have decided to collaborate on this paper of sex ed podcast pedagogy and transforming conversations to educational content. So, the three questions that have driven our research was, are youth truly really innocent, in need of shielding, or do they already have an awareness or a critical thinking already? And also, how can educators use parent-led sex ed podcasts as a curriculum collaborators? And our third, how could educators make sex ed themes interdisciplinary and cross-curricular? So these are the three standpoints that really have driven our paper. Okay, so historically, parents have been positioned either as gatekeepers or advocates when it comes to sex education and media coverage. We always tend to hear that, parents, they're always shielding their kids or students. They have to hold their innocence as long as possible.
But there's a 2024 national survey that found that 76% of Canadian parents actually support school-based sexual education, and they want it to be inclusive and accessible. Similarly, there's also a 2022 research from Queensland, Australia, shows that most primary school parents support school-based relationships and sexuality education, though some raised concerns about timing and transparency in delivery. But still, the majority recognizes that the world has changed and children today are growing up exposed to more information and misinformation on the internet at a very young age. So the debate isn't necessarily whether children should be learning these things, but it's more about how the material is taught when it is introduced, when it is introduced, and whether it reflects the values that families hold.
In addition to that, so we have looked at our methods.
So,
yeah, you go ahead.
2023 UNESCO research shows that digital spaces are playing an increasingly important role in how sexuality education is shared, especially in ways that feel personal and very responsive to family contexts. So to explore how parent-led podcasts can inform educational practice, we began with 10 episodes from a selection of parenting-focused podcast shows that directly address sex education and related topics to sex. So the selection criteria is very clear. First, the podcasts needed to be very publicly accessible. They had to speak about key sex ed topics, and we looked for diversity of voices from professionals to everyday parents. And each of these episodes served real dialogues that show not only what parents talk about, but how they talk about them to their kids.
Great. Next page. So in addition to the podcast, we also examine policy documents, so such as the MEES, the Quebec's Culture and Citizenship Curriculum that just came out in 2024, also the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or Constitution, and the Education Act directly from the Légis Québec website. So these texts all helped us understand what's currently being mandated in schools, and also how parent-led insights might complement or even challenge those formal structures. Yeah. So that's a lot of. So we have looked at our critical childhood studies frameworks that challenge the traditional idea that children are innocent, passive, or unknowing. We also looked at the United Nations Convention of Rights of the Child framework that affirms that children have a legal right to knowledge, especially knowledge that supports their safety, identity, and well-being. Of course, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, and how children are positioned in an environment and how they all interact with each other. Then we also have Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development, which emphasizes the role of social interaction using a student-centered approach, and of course, different learning methods and tools and resources. And lastly, but not least, but Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed that argues that children shouldn't that education should treat students as passive recipients of knowledge, but also be dialogical and liberatory and co-created.
So one of the strongest messages across all podcasts was that consent is not a topic to introduce in adolescence. Instead, it's taught early and practiced as part of everyday life. Consent is framed in body autonomy, where the idea that children should understand their body belongs to them. When children are taught to assert their boundaries, whether it's about hugs, tickling, or friendly interactions, they learn that their voices matter. And teaching consent proactively creates a foundation of safety before any threats are introduced.
So second theme we also looked at was destigmatizing the shame and embracing pleasure. So many parents on the podcast have actively working to unlearn the idea that pleasure is inappropriate, it's a taboo, and also a stigma. So we're also talking about general curiosity takes away the child's innocence. And one of the episodes it also mentioned that the only thing that can take away their innocence is an offender. Whew. Instead of avoiding these topics out of fear, parents are teaching that knowledge is a form of protection, and it doesn't corrupt, it empowers. So, and pleasure doesn't have to be shameful. They want their children to understand their bodies, including the parts that bring comfort and joy.
Another theme that stood out was how adults relate to children during these conversations and how emotional honesty plays a very central role. Many of the podcast hosts share that they didn't grow up with open or affirming sex education themselves. And instead of pretending to be experts, they admitted that they were still learning themselves. And in doing so, they modeled co-learning, and that kind of vulnerability builds trust, and teaching becomes so powerful. This authenticity matters more than expertise and makes space for deeper connection.
And lastly, of course, we're navigating cultural tensions. So we're looking at intergenerational trauma, what parents have considered taboos, and they're bringing their own values on their own children. And what else? Affirming and honoring cultural, religious, and personal contexts that students bring in the classroom with them, of course. Yeah. Yay, my favorite topic. So the culture and citizenship curriculum in Quebec. So like I said before, it is a new subject area in the province of Quebec that has replaced the original ethics and religious cultures course that basically the ethics and religious cultures course was solely, it was always based on facts or on a westernized opinion. And what we want to do is designed to promote secularism in schools and also allow students from K to 12 to explore their own values and encourages parental involvement. And also, I believe it has a lot of potential. However, it's the teachers that maybe lack the resources or the time in the class.
So to finish up, this study shows how informal media like parent-led sex ed podcasts can hold powerful pedagogical value. In these dialogues, we hear tension, joy, awkwardness, and wisdom, and we hear parents doing the emotional labor of learning alongside their children. If educators listen closely, this content can guide us to not just in what we teach, but in how we teach, the tone, the timing, and the emotional nuance. With the help of these podcasts, we are encouraged to move toward a pedagogy that shapes the new language for sex education, one that is collaborative, curious, and ultimately more human. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Erica.
All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll present my literature review on the importance of teaching consent and promoting healthy sexuality in early childhood education. Often these topics are reserved for older children, but evidence suggests that early interventions, especially for children ages 0 to 5, is crucial for developing bodily autonomy, understanding boundaries, and forming healthy relationships. My research question based on my literature review is, what theories and strategies might support the teaching of consent and healthy sexuality in early childhood education settings? Based on the theoretical framework, I've grounded my research on Bronfenbrenner's ecological system theories, which helps us understand how multiple layers of child environment, family, school, and society shapes their development. So starting with the microsystem, which includes the child's immediate environment, parents, teachers, siblings, and peers. These are the people who interact with the child daily and have a direct impact on their development. In the context of sexuality education, this is where the child learns from bodily autonomy, consent, and respectful touch. For example, when a teacher uses correct anatomical language or respects a child's no to a hug, they are reinforcing foundational lessons about consent. The mesosystem affects the connection between different parts of the microsystem. So how parents and educators interact, for example. If a teacher and a parent communicate well and share values about bodily autonomy, children receive the consistent message which helps reinforce learning. On the other hand, if there's a tension or disagreement, say a parent does not want their child learning the proper names for body parts, it can create confusion for the child and undermine the educational process. The third layer is the ecosystem, which includes factors that indirectly influence the child, like educational policies, professional development, and opportunities for educators or parental work schedules. For instance, if an educator hasn't been trained on how to approach gender diversity or consent in age-appropriate ways, they might avoid the topic entirely. That avoidance then trickles down to the classroom and then the child's learning experience. The macro system consists of a broader cultural values, societal norms, laws, and ideologies. This layer is very important when it comes to healthy sexuality education because it's where the stigma, taboo, and resistance often originates. In some cultures, sex education is still seen as inappropriate for young children, even though research shows that early age-appropriate conversation helps prevent abuse and promote mental well-being. Lastly is the chronosystem, which represents the element of time and how attitudes, laws, and social movement changes over time. For example, there's now more recognition of the need for inclusive education and more advocacy for children's rights to bodily autonomy, which was once taboo, like acknowledging children's curiosity about their bodies, is now beginning to be viewed as a natural part of their development. This changing landscape shapes both the educational system and family values over time. So Bronfenbrenner's model reminds us that children's learning about sexuality is never happening in a vacuum. Relationships, school environments, cultural values, and the passage of time shapes it. Understanding these layers help educators and caregivers approach the topic more thoughtfully and with greater sensitivity to the large influence at play. So my whole paper talks about normalizing conversations. So it is important to normalize conversations about the body and that children should be taught the proper terms like penis, vagina, scrotum, and vulva, not only for accuracy, but for empowerment. When these words are avoided, children may internalize shame or confusion. Educators can support this learning by using books, games, and play-based activities that integrate body education into everyday learning moments. Curiosity. Children in all ages occur and have moments of curiosity, and it is natural for them to be curious about their body. This often shows up in self-touching, asking questions, or comparing body parts. These behaviors, especially in early childhood education settings, are developmentally typically and should not be shamed. Educators and caregivers must respond with openness and guidance rather than punishment and avoidance. This is key to fostering healthy, shame-free understanding of their bodies. However, there are some educational barriers and parental influences that limit the sex education in early childhood education systems. Starting off with educational barriers, unfortunately, they're still significant within early childhood education. Many educators feel discomfort, especially due to anticipated parental backlash. Others may not feel confident due to the lack of training. The issues highlight a need for evidence-based professional development so that educators feel more empowered and prepared to teach these topics with confidence and respect. Going on to parental influences, parents play a central role in shaping children's views. Gender ideology can strongly influence what's considered appropriate, often reinforcing stereotypes. For example, some parents may discourage boys from activities seen as feminine, like dance or dolls, which this limits children's development. It is essential that educators work with families to help see them the value in supporting children fully identity explore. Many parents do oppose early sexuality education because they believe it takes away from a child's innocence. But this idea of innocence is more of a social construct than a biological fact. Adults often project their own discomfort onto children. Avoiding these conversations does more harm than good. It prevents children from developing the knowledge and confidence to set boundaries and understand themselves. The whole ideology of my body, my choice, which is bodily autonomy's central theme in early sexuality education. Children need to learn that their body is their own and that it includes making choices about how they dress and how they interact and how they play. Unfortunately, societal gender norms often restrict this. We see this in how toys are marketed or how boys are discouraged from expressing emotions or softness. Supporting autonomy means creating a space for children to explore beyond these limits. Teaching consent starts with everyday actions, letting children decide if they want to hug a relative. If they say no, it should be respected. We should also teach up if something feels wrong, we should say something. Role-playing and open dialogue are great tools for this. The goal is to ensure children are prepared, aware, and confident in setting boundaries. Teaching consent and healthy sexuality from a young, early age is not only appropriate, it's necessary. It helps children understand their bodies, set boundaries, and develop into confident individuals. But it requires the support of both educators and families. By normalizing these conversations and providing developmentally appropriate education, we can build safer and more respectful communities for children to grow up in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Ellie and Muke.
Hi everyone. My name is Ellie.
And I'm Muke.
And today we will be sharing our research on, okay. Oh. It's okay. Let's start from the top. My name is Ellie.
And I'm Muke.
And today we'll be sharing our research on sexuality education for youth with autism. This project explores the systemic barriers that prevent these learners from receiving meaningful, inclusive sex ed and argues for a practical change.
Yes. So sex education is a basic human right, and it's an important aspect of a person's well-being. Yet children with autism are still left out of developmentally appropriate sex education programs. And this isn't just an oversight, it reflects harmful assumptions that youth with autism are asexual, uninterested in relationships, or maybe just incapable of understanding sexual concepts. And the consequences of this exclusion are serious because they lack knowledge about relationships, consent, or communicating boundaries. And this lack of knowledge puts them at a higher risk of sexual victimization.
Next slide. So our goal is to recognize the existing gaps and look at the current practices and think of ways to create a system that's inclusive and empowering. So we applied 2 frameworks to help us sort of guide and critique the existing system. So the first is the critical disability studies, which challenges ableist views in education and centers justice and inclusion for students with disabilities.
Yes, and our second framework is the psychoeducational framework, which supports the idea that education should be tailored to each learner's specific needs, whether it be cognitive or social or language-based.
So our critical literature review revealed many findings. Firstly, and most generally, youth with autism are excluded from sex ed altogether or receive content that does not match their developmental needs. Specifically, Canadian curricula are outdated and vary widely by province. There's no national standard, so some children may receive a stronger, more adaptable education than others. So when it comes to inclusivity of those with disabilities, there's no policy that effectively meets their needs of those who have unique learning experiences. The little education that they do receive is often risk-focused rather than supporting healthy development. This risk-focused mindset reflects societal discomfort with the idea of neurodivergent individuals being sexual. This leads to youth with ASD being left out of sex education.
And as there is no structured and supervised sex education in many schools across Canada, teachers usually feel untrained and unsure. And without proper resources, they rely on personal comfort levels and beliefs, which again can leave some students feeling unsupported. Those who feel uncomfortable, meaning the teachers, can even opt out of certain topics, especially when it comes to teaching populations with a disability. And the research that investigates the perspectives of teachers often shows that teachers usually have the desire to provide comprehensive and inclusive sex education, but they highlight the barriers that they face when there's no resources for them to provide high-quality education. And when we look at the perspectives of youth with autism, they also report the lack of support and education they receive when it comes to sex education. They feel excluded and misunderstood when it comes to sexual health, and some reflect on how they received no information or education when it comes to sexual health. And those who received some type of education reported how surface level the education was. And there was a consistency in the reports that showed that the education they received did not meet their learning needs, and this reflected in their confusion and struggles when it comes to their sexuality and sexual health. In several studies, youth with autism reported their difficulty in navigating social norms around sexuality and communicating and understanding boundaries when it came to sexual behaviors. And lastly, when we look at the parents' perspective, they also share the opinions of the youth. And they also reported how they wanted to support their children, but they felt lost, and they were not given any guidance and did not have the opportunity to collaborate with the school. And they felt this gap in support when it came to sexual education. And they also displayed their desire for guidelines and intervention programs that could help in their efforts to support their children's sexual development.
So this needs to change because sex ed isn't just a subject. I mean, clearly. It's so much more. So receiving sex education does not only provide knowledge to youth with ASD around sex and sexuality, it also protects them against the dangers that come with sex as well as improve their overall well-being. If we create individualized plans for math or readings, why can't we do the same for sex ed? Thank you.
All right, and our very last presenter is Charlotte.
Hi, everyone. All right. Yeah, my name is Charlotte. I'm finishing my undergrad, and I'm going to be talking to you all today about smell walks, which are exploratory activities orienting our senses of smell. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about the transformative potentials in pedagogy of smell walks, especially in early childhood sexuality education. So I first learned about smell walking in this class from a 2023 article by Louisa Allen, and it really got me thinking about how sexuality education often marginalizes the body and its pleasures. My research was guided by two central questions. I wanted to know, how might somatic approaches benefit the classroom and apply to sexuality education? And what possibilities might emerge by centering the body through pleasure and joy rather than risk and prevention in traditionally disembodied sex ed curricula? The current state of sexuality education is fraught. The right to comprehensive sexuality education is well established and involves cognition, emotion, and the physical and social components of sexuality, but Canada is failing to establish this right by providing a curricula that is critically disembodied, not comprehensive, and limited by themes of harm, risk, and prevention. Canadian educators have expressed some discomfort and uncertainty in broaching comprehensive sexuality topics, in particular ones that involve perceived taboos around pleasure and the body, like masturbation and expression of queer identities. So how can educators provide comprehensive sexuality education in their classrooms? This question is even more pertinent when it comes to ECE, because of the prevalence of notions about childhood innocence and asexuality, which shroud discourses on sex ed in schools. So one solution to all of these questions and concerns could be by introducing pleasure-oriented smell walks into early childhood pedagogy. Olfactory activities can help to address crucial topics in sex ed in a way that feels maybe more approachable to educators and meets students' unique needs during their formative years. Olfaction aligns with comprehensive sexuality education in that both relate to physical, social, emotional, and cognitive factors. And while smell hasn't commonly been linked to sexuality, the parallels are there, which are highlighted through my theoretical frameworks. My research paper combines smell walking with a few different theoretical frameworks. I mostly drew from embodiment theory, which underscores the necessity of sensorial integration for a holistic understanding of the world and the self. I also drew from Audre Lorde's theory from 1987 of uses of the erotic, which emphasizes extracognitive knowledge and relational joys in futurity. And finally, relationality, which comes from research in somatic therapy modalities and identifies the interplay between people, our environments, our bodies, and the actions between all of these. These frameworks helped to ground my work about smell walking through a pleasurable, relational, and embodied lens. I conducted a literature review to fill the current gap between sexuality education and smell walking in ECE in particular. I wanted to answer my guiding questions and synthesize the relevant research so that it could become hopefully more accessible to classroom spaces. I used the Concordia Library search engine alongside Google Scholar to find an initial 10 sources, using search terms like the ones, like the search terms like the ones on the screen. And then after that, I reviewed the reference lists of those papers and incorporated relevant additional sources. So what actually is a smell walk, and how can this activity be done in ECE and sexuality education settings? Smell walks are movement-based olfactory explorations of our environments. Instead of leading with our eyes during the walks, we lead with our noses, and in my work, our pleasures. There are two main methods, smell catching and smell hunting. Smell catching is a bit more passive and involves just noticing what odors and aromas are there in the environment. And then smell hunting, on the other hand, is more active and involves following a specific scent and tracing it to its source. Common suggestions from the literature include keeping the smell walk duration to under 45 minutes in order to prevent olfactory fatigue. It is also important to plan a route ahead of time, ideally with some collaboration from smell walkers, and to keep group sizes within 12 people. In early childhood education, shorter walks might be best to keep focus and prevent other forms of fatigue, like mental or physical exhaustion for children and educators alike. Prompts should also be considered collaboratively beforehand. Louisa Allen gave the example, what smells are present in my neighborhood and do they relate to sexuality? I thought of some other prompts that might be better suited for early learners and focus more directly on pleasure and somatic attunement. So some examples would be, what smells do you enjoy the most? What were those smells like? If you could give the smell a name, what would you name it? Other questions or discussion prompts might be, how or where did you feel the smell in your body? How do you know that you or your body likes the smell? How do you know if someone else likes the smell? And how do we know if that changes? So discussion prompts like these could be helpful for exploring topics like communication, boundaries, relationships, and consent through a lens of pleasure, joy, and connection. Communication about the smell walk can be done through speech, body language, and facial expressions, or other arts-based approaches like through smell notes and smell maps. Smell notes are ways of reflecting on and documenting smell walk experiences or prompts, and these can be done through writing, drawing, photography, narrative play, and so on. Smell maps are similar, but they focus more on the overall smell walk experience and the physical landscape in a more linear way. And arts-based approaches are really important because they offer freedom to young students in their self-expression and allow access to forms of knowledge that are otherwise restrained by linguistic limitations. Like, for example, in English, there are only 3 dedicated olfactory descriptive words: smell, smelly, stinky, and musty. So here's an example that I found from an article from last year, and this is a Norwegian kindergartner's smell map, which was annotated for the research purposes by the educator in collaboration with the student. But I thought, because I'm not 0 to 8 years old, this would be a good way of giving an example for ECE and giving you guys a visual of what that actually looks like. So further research is really important because of the current gap in the literature in terms of combining comprehensive sexual education with early childhood education and smell walking practices. In the future, I would like to publish my findings in a zine or video format in order to make the literature even more accessible and applicable to educators in these spaces, and also so that community members can learn and get involved themselves. I would also like to see or even participate in establishing further methods, lesson plans, and templates for smell walks and smell notes and smell maps that would best serve early learners and give them more freedom to experience and share their pleasures in the classroom. So to sum up, my research finds that smell walks are wonderful opportunities to center children's lived, embodied experience and to normalize their pleasures in education spaces. Smell walks can also formally and informally contribute to comprehensive sexuality education by relating to consent, body agency, relationships, self-expression, and sense of self in early childhood education. Ultimately, the reciprocal pedagogy of smell walking makes it possible to reframe, rethink, and remake traditional sexual education. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody. Oh my gosh, those were amazing papers. You all did an incredible job. So we do actually have about 10 to 15 minutes if anyone in the crowd, online or in person, would like to ask any of the presenters a question. Or if the presenters would like to ask themselves questions, also legit.
So for those of you who are in the space who have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring this microphone to you. Just a note that if you're someone who is answering the question, we'll ask that you come up to the podium to answer. And for those of you who are joining us online, feel free to raise a virtual hand or pop your question into the chat and we'll get them to our presenters. Does anyone have a question? Vanessa, let me go check. Yes, Vanessa, if you wanted to unmute, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone. I meant to do a clapping emoji, not a hand up emoji.
Well received, thank you.
I have a question for Megan.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the infantilization, can't say this word, infantilization, thank you, of older adults due to so-called regressions in body or cognitive functions. If and how that came up in your narrative review and your thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, yeah, so it actually did come up in some of the literature. There was, except it wasn't about sex education. I was looking at some of the literature about education in later life, specifically in art education. And there was this quote from an older man, I think he was 69, if I'm thinking of the right person, but he said something along the lines of like, I want educators to know that we're not kindergartners. And was really talking about this infantilization in older adult education where they were afraid to critique the work in an art education space, and how everything was just perfect and great. And he was like, I'm here to learn and I want to be critiqued. And how sometimes this emphasis on play and collaboration in later life education can also come off as infantilizing. So I don't know, there's like this balance between these these fun pedagogies and also like respecting that older adults like who grew up within traditional education systems and want access to those education systems in later life. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool.
I'm going to abuse my privileges because I have a microphone. My question is actually for the two group papers. And my question is to Anna and Daniela and to Muge and LA, how do your papers, do you think, talk to each other? That's my question. Any one of you all can answer.
I believe what we could find a connection between how, like for example, provincially, the CCQ is compulsory. So for the topic, for the other group's topic, it's that children with autism or they're on the spectrum should and deserve to have a chance to learn about different types or different types of sexual educational pleasures or desires. Would you like to add to that?
So we also try to focus our studies on specifically Canadian curricula. And one of the papers, so Davies, looked at curricula for, what was it, Ontario, an Ontario curricula. So all provinces offer different curricula on sex ed. It's not a specific curriculum that they all follow, it's all different. We spoke about this in class. So I'm taking Ontario's curricula specifically in this context. And they offered sex education for children with autism, but it wasn't sufficient enough. It did not meet the needs. It was not fulfilling enough for them. And so I think more specifically, if we were to have more time to talk about the subject, I think they deserve a curricula that's more suited to their needs. So maybe more sensory needs, more visual prompts, open communication between parents, between the schools, between the child, giving them a voice. What questions are they asking? Giving them a space to ask those questions because they do take more time to get to that comfort level. So I guess just co-creating a space that's safe for them in every province.
Thank you.
Additionally, again, in our papers, like we didn't cover like parents who have children with special needs or autism. So we could, if we had more time or more paper or more pages to open up and elaborate on that, definitely that would be something to look at.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to abuse my privileges again. What about the abstinence papers? If we think about Chris and we think about Clement's work, what might they offer each other? What kind of connections might we see between these two kinds of examples of abstinence? Like Chris is asking us to reframe the binary between comprehensive sex ed and abstinence. And then Clement is asking us to consider what parents' experiences are in Ghana, to think about why abstinence prevails. So I'm interested, what do you think your papers say to each other?
Okay, so upon listening to Grace's presentation, I noticed from her background, they are also concerned with taboos and norms. That is the same way with Ghanaians. So I think we can revive how the curriculum is to introduce more light on how tradition and also in a form of norms or culture can change the way people think about sex ed.
Well, I think we have something in common as the school-based sex ed and the family sex education. Well, one of the part of my findings is the school has a part of responsibility to give the parents a direction and some resources to let them know what their students have, what their children have learned in the school, and so they can do something that can align with the curriculum and the pedagogy. So yeah, I think this is something that we share something in common.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. I love that I get to abuse the microphone. Anyone can stop me at any time, but too bad you're not stopping me. Okay, what about the early childhood papers? If we think about Vanessa, if we think about Charlotte, and we think about Erica, like where are we seeing commonalities and tensions between the papers? What do you see adding to each other's papers? Any thoughts?
Okay, I was handed this microphone, so I'm gonna just talk. I think that something that all of the early childhood-based papers have in common is emphasizing the importance of like going beyond and outside of, sometimes in literal ways, the classroom and the confines of what that looks like, either expanding it or moving literally outside of that, and the importance of emphasizing children's own knowledge and lived experiences and how important it is to emphasize embodiment in that. That knowledge isn't just about the mind and the conventions of what academia looks like now and is thought of and is conceived of to be. Does anyone else want to go, or should I just start singing or something?
It's also on the notion of they're so young and they could be easily taken advantage of. So when they understand their whole bodily autonomy and understand like what parts that they have in their function, they are in control of their body, they are in control of their environment, and just it's healthy within themselves to know like what their body could do. So it's a pretty much of an emphasis on that.
Vanessa, do you want to say anything?
I actually had my hand up from a little while ago. So it's not specifically to this topic, but I've been here with my cousin who lives in California and is currently doing her master's in diversity and special education. And she was really intrigued by Ellie and Mugi, your paper. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to share that paper with me so I could share it with her, because she'd really like to build off of it and read your research. Yeah, she was very impressed by it.
Yes, of course. I'm sure we can create like a open discussion, and I'll just link it there.
even to the slides.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay, now I have the toughest one, because obviously I would ask Liz and Frida to talk to each other, but Liz went to Europe, so she left. So instead, I'm gonna ask Lauren, Megan, and Frida, what kinds of connections could we make? We've got elders, we've got bodies and menstruation, we've got a systems critique of what's possible and what exists. Maybe it's the possibilities, maybe that's the link of like futurity and what's possible and an unlearning, maybe. But I don't want to answer for you. What do you all think might be a potential connection between your three really disparate papers?
I think the paper that I wrote is based on the background that I'm coming from first, and it's coming from pain. Because the community that I grew up, Black and racialized community back in Iran, Sistan and Baluchistan, literally we do not have any sex ed curriculum or education. So it was always about something that was happening in the background, obviously regarding things that are not even happening in the day-to-day life of youth. And then moving to Canada, working in Black communities again, the process was whatever I was teaching, it was just like my Black students and racialized students wouldn't connect to that. And then at the end of the day, I thought it's as if that I'm teaching and they are not obviously engaging, and two lines are not never crossing each other. And then what you're gonna where would you gonna go with the process of teaching something and then the process of teaching never is happening? So to me, at the end of the day, it's always the fact that there is a need out there, and education system in Canada is failing to offer. And at the end of the day, I'm not teaching anything. I'm not putting anything into conversation with any of my students, and the whole process becoming absolutely absurd. That's the reason that at the end of my presentation, I mentioned that we do not need a reform. We need to restart everything from what we are receiving from our youth, rather than always being at the center of everything, saying, I think this is necessary and we have to teach this and that.
Thanks. That is a toughie. One connection I see with your work is about the idea of surveillance. I'm thinking about, particularly in long-term care, this surveillance of older adults, and there's this idea of like the busy bodies, how in long-term care they try to like fill older adults' time with like all these activities. And so, the surveillance and kind of like disciplining of older adults' sexualities, whether allowed to have one or, have sex or date or access toys or porn, is like mediated by other people. And that goes back to some of the things we were talking about in terms of surveillance of youth and their sexualities. In terms of the menstruation/uterus thing, I did see a connection with the idea of educating on menopause. Like we've talked about in class, I think it would be really generative to teach across the life course, not just what's happening in your body now, but what could be happening in the future, which would obviously have effects on older adults. Is Lauren still here? Oh.
Never mind. I totally thought Lauren was just like hiding behind Charlotte. Well, that's awkward. And anyway, never mind. Welcome, Francis. Welcome, Tyler. Well, thank you guys so much for this like extremely generative class. I learned so much from you all. Thank you so much for doing this amazing, like real conference where you showed real papers and explored issues that mattered to you in sex ed. This has been such a joy for me, and I can't wait to spend the next few days with your papers and your thinking. And I'm hearing the notion from people that they might want to read each other's papers, so I can create like a private for our class only Google Drive situation where you can go and read each other's papers if you want to read them and comment and things. And then that'll just exist for us. It can be like a little library. But thank you all so much. Megan and their partner Abby and I did ice cakes with some key themes and takeaways we'd like you to enjoy for the rest of the summer, including pleasure, queer joy, play, and I forget what the other one was. Oh yeah, drag pedagogy. That's what we left you all with. So thank you all so much for the semester. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to Fourth Space for hosting us this afternoon. We're so thankful. And Vanessa, we miss you.
Okay, thank you so much to every single one of you for your wonderful presentations. Thank you for bringing this class in, for this fantastic conversation, and for your questions, and for really activating this space. We're going to go ahead, close up the Zoom and the live stream now, but a quick reminder that this is already available on our YouTube channel if you wish to revisit or share it. So thanks so much, and we hope to see you again at Fourth Space sometime. Have a great evening.